Have you ever wondered what lurks behind the screams in your favorite Halloween movies? What real-life horrors inspired the nightmares brought to life on screen? While it'd be nice to think that the most terrifying movies are just a product of some filmmaker's macabre imagination, the truth is often more chilling than fiction. From crazed wild animals to psychotic killers, each of these Halloween classics has a disturbing history that's as real as it gets. Prepare to be shocked, scared, and fascinated as we unveil the real-life horror stories that spawn some of the most unforgettable cinematic nightmares. But be warned, this video might just change the way you look at these movies forever. The Birds, 1963. Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds is undoubtedly one of the most iconic horror films ever made. However, what many don't realize is that the terror depicted in the film is rooted in a nightmarish and frankly repulsive real-life event that unfolded in the quiet coastal town of Capitola, California on August 18, 1961. The eerie saga began at 3 a.m. when residents were awoken by nightmarish hordes of seabirds screaming and crashing into their homes. Bravely, some went out to investigate, only to find that the birds were inexplicably drawn to their flashlights. 8 people were bitten, and countless others found themselves on the receiving end of aerial assaults. As the chaos continued through the night, the birds took out the power supply by crashing into electrical lines, and the local sheriff struggled to keep his car on the road as they repeatedly bombarded it. Finally, dawn broke, revealing a horrifying sight that would scar the town's memory forever. The birds weren't just angry, they were sick. Capitola had been transformed into a grotesque wasteland covered in a foul mixture of bird excrement and regurgitated anchovies. The streets were littered with fish skeletons, and the stench was overpowering. One motel would later recount the grim spectacle, saying, "Struggling to the door, I was awed at the sight of hundreds of birds, all with the cries of a baby. They were heavy with sardines, unable to fly, and lost in the dense fog as they came in from the sea attracted by our lights. They slammed against the building, regurgitating fish blood and knocking themselves out." Tragically, a few of the birds survived the night, and as they perished, their corpses added to the horrifying scene that was now swarming with cats that were attracted by the putrid and overwhelmingly fishy smell. News of this horrifying incident made headlines, catching the attention of none other than Alfred Hitchcock himself. Hitchcock had been in search of a follow-up to Psycho, and he had plans to adapt Daphne du Maurier's short story The Birds. So for him, the news couldn't have come at a better time. Unfortunately, though, the journey to bring The Birds to the silver screen turned out to be just as harrowing as the actual events that inspired it. The initial plan had been to use mechanical crows, which they plowed $200,000 into before realizing they looked too fake. This led to a frantic scramble to capture 25,000 wild birds, who were understandably and aggressively uncooperative. The crew faced daily attacks, especially from the seagulls, who they discovered would deliberately go for their eyes. On the worst day, 13 crew members were hospitalized with bites or scratches, but by far, the worst off was the leading lady Tippi Hedren. She was frequently locked in a confined space with the live birds as they viciously attacked her, and for close-up shots, the birds were tied to her clothing, pecking frantically at her as they tried to escape. Oddly, Hedren seemed to fare no better with the mechanical crows. In one harrowing scene, she was trapped in a phone booth supposedly made of shatterproof glass. However, when the third fake bird collided with it, the glass shattered, showering her with shards that took hours for the makeup artist to painstakingly tweeze from her face. The only semblance of justice came when a large flock of crows managed to escape and decided to perch in a tree directly above Hitchcock's car. Each day, they relentlessly coated it with their excrement, evading recapture until the film crew had no choice but to concede defeat and cut down the tree. So, while The Birds may have left an indelible mark on cinema history, the horrifying reality that inspired it left an equally unforgettable scar on the town of Capitola, its residents, and the brave souls who brought this cinematic nightmare to life. A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984. Wes Craven's 1984 masterpiece, A Nightmare on Elm Street, is an undisputed classic in the horror genre. made all the more spine-tingling by the chilling fact that it draws inspiration from a true story. In the early 1980s, Craven was on the hunt for his next big idea and stumbled across something that sounded just terrifying enough in a small article in the LA Times. A healthy 21-year-old man who'd recently relocated from Cambodia had been having terrifying nightmares like nothing he'd ever experienced before. They were so bad that he developed a paralyzing fear of falling asleep and had been trying to avoid it at all costs. Desperate for a solution, his family sought medical help, resulting in a prescription for sleeping pills. However, even with the medication, he managed to stay awake for an astonishing 6 days straight. Eventually, after a week of torment, he fell asleep on the living room couch, and his relief family carried him to his bed. Tragically, just a few hours later, their relief would turn into terror as they heard crashes and screams coming from his bedroom. By the time they reached him, it was too late. He was dead. Inside his closet, they found a Mr. Coffee Maker that had been using to stay awake, along with a stash of discarded sleeping pills that he'd pretended to take. At first, they assumed the cause of death to be some form of stress and caffeine-induced heart attack, but his autopsy revealed nothing wrong with his heart, and so they wrote it up as unexplained. In isolation, his story was strange enough, but Craven noticed something. There was a pattern. Through further investigation, he found numerous other articles, all describing similar unexplained deaths amongst the Southeast Asian refugee population. Many young men had fled persecution in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam to start a new life in America, only to find themselves afflicted by such terrifying PTSD-induced nightmares that they were refusing to sleep. Then, when they did eventually pass out, they'd find themselves literally scared to death as their hearts beat out of control. More research revealed that this was not just a phenomenon that affected refugees. Men had been dying across Asia, where locals had dubbed it the nightmare death. Today, it's referred to as unexplained nocturnal death syndrome, but the root cause still remains hazy. Some cases have been linked to structural or genetic abnormalities affecting the heart, but in other events, there's been nothing wrong with the victims' hearts, and night terrors have been listed as a mysterious but legitimate cause. As for the film, the eerie real-life inspirations didn't end there, as no one knows what the men saw in their dreams as they died. Craven was faced with the challenge of creating a menacing character to terrorize his film's victims, and he chose a guy from his own life. One night as a child, Craven had been awoken by a homeless drunk man on the street outside. He went to his window to look, and the pair made long, uncomfortable eye contact. Freaked out, Craven went and hid for what he said felt like hours, but when he returned to the window, the guy was still there, staring straight back at him. Then, things got worse. He started walking backward without breaking eye contact and rounded the corner that led to the entrance of Craven's apartment building. Terrified, he ran to his front door and heard the man enter the building. Fortunately, at this point, he decided to wake his brother, who scared the man off. Haunted by this unsettling experience even years later, Craven crafted the iconic appearance of Freddy Krueger, including his trademark hat, based on the memory of that night. As we delve further into the reality behind these Halloween classics, they get more difficult to stomach. So here's a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. But stay tuned, because we really have saved the worst for last. The Lighthouse, 2019. One of the lesser-known but most highly rated films on our list is The Lighthouse, a 2019 thriller that plunges viewers into the harrowing experience of two lighthouse keepers as they try desperately to cling to their sanity while secluded on a remote New England island. The true story behind it is so terrifying that it remains a dark blot on maritime history and led to an immediate change in lighthouse policy. The tragedy occurred in 1801 when two lighthouse keepers, Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith, were stationed on the Smalls, a tiny cluster of rocks 20 miles off the coast of Wales. The lighthouse itself was a solitary wooden cabin perched on wooden stilts directly atop the rocky outcrop. With no lands around them, the keepers were confined to the cramped 5-meter cabin for months on end. Neither Howell nor Griffiths were particularly keen on the posting, as they openly disliked each other, and the prospect of spending months together in isolation sounded like torture. But as they had families to feed, they decided to go ahead regardless. Their troubles began almost as soon as they landed on the Smalls, as Griffith was injured in a freak accident that left him incapacitated. Howell sent out a distress signal to every vessel that passed, but the seas were too rough for the ships to land, so no help came. Eventually, after weeks in agony, Griffith succumbed to his injuries and passed away. This left Howell with two horrifying options: dispose of the body at sea, which risked accusations of murder, or live with the corpse until help arrived. He chose the latter. At first, he kept Griffith's body in the cabin and ate, slept, and lived alongside the rotting corpse. But after a few short weeks, the stench of decomposition became unbearable. So he fashioned a rudimentary coffin for Griffith, dragged it onto the platform outside, and lashed it to the railings. Unfortunately, the winds were too strong for Howell's haphazard attempt at a coffin, so it soon broke open, allowing Griffith's arm to dangle out and sway in the wind. Horrifyingly, to the now traumatized Howell, it looked very much like his former colleague was waving at him or beckoning him to come outside. Eventually, the rest of the coffin disintegrated, but Griffith's body got caught in the ropes that had lashed it to the railings, and for the next 3 weeks, Howell had to endure the chilling sight and was tormented by the incessant thudding of the corpse as it pounded against the cabin walls. Meanwhile, back on dry land, both of the lighthouse keepers' families were consumed by worry. The distress signal had been going out for 4 months, but in all that time, no one had been able to land on the desolate rocks. Their only glimmer of hope was that the light continued to burn, so they knew at least one of the keepers was alive. Finally, the seas calmed enough for a small boat to land and bring Howell home. But tragically, the trauma of the isolation, accompanied by the intense distress of living alongside Griffith's corpse, had rendered him both physically and mentally unrecognizable to his family, who described him as a hollow, broken man. In direct response to the tragedy, Lighthouse policies were rewritten to mandate a minimum of 3 men at each posting. This way, if one should die, the others will both have a witness and another person for human contact, ensuring that no one would have to endure such isolation and horror alone ever again. The Exorcist, 1973. Known as the scariest horror movie in history, The Exorcist is infamous for causing early audiences to faint, vomit, and/or storm out in protest. But did you know that it's also based on a true story that highlights the terrifying history of exorcisms? While the film depicts a young girl possessed by a demon, the real victim was Roland Hunkeler, a 13-year-old boy from Cottage City, Maryland. His trouble began in 1949 when his aunt taught him to use a Ouija board before passing away. Not long after her death, the family started hearing eerie dripping and scratching noises in the house. Then, Roland's furniture began flying around the room as he slept, and unexplained scratches appeared on his body. Initially, the family turned to the Lutheran pastor for help, but when he witnessed the levitating objects firsthand, he decided the case was beyond him and referred them to a Catholic priest. What followed wasn't just one singular dramatic exorcism, but a grueling 3 months of attempts by multiple priests in numerous locations. The first was attempted by Roman Catholic priest Edward Hughes at the Georgetown University Hospital, but it had to be abandoned when Roland plunged his hand into the mattress, broke off a metal spring, and used it to attack the priest. Shortly afterward, the word Lewis mysteriously appeared scratched into the boy's skin. So seeing it as a sign or instruction from the demon, they took him to St. Louis University. There, 2 priests, Halloran and Bodern, claimed to have witnessed Roland's bed shake uncontrollably as he slept, furniture flip over, and a crucifix move down the bed on its own. Unfortunately, though, they were unable to remove the demon, so Roland spent the next few months bouncing between St. Louis, the Alexian Brothers Hospital, and even home when they mistakenly thought he was cured. In each facility, he was subjected to more attempts where he was restrained, sprinkled with holy water, and shouted at in Latin. He, or his demon, responded by screaming inexplicably, speaking in Latin, urinating, swearing, and spitting at the priests. In one event, he even escaped his restraints and broke Priest Halloran's nose. Another worrying symptom was that the words hell and evil would appear on Roland's chest in deep red scratches. And at one point, welts formed in the image of the devil on his leg. Eventually, after months of torment for all involved, the priests attempted one final exorcism and gave it all they had. They surrounded him with crucifixes, holy relics, medals, and rosaries, and screamed at Satan that St. Michael was coming to battle him for Roland's soul. This supposed battle lasted just 7 minutes before Roland emerged from his trance, claiming to have witnessed St. Michael vanquishing the devil and 10 demons on a great battlefield. The demon had finally been expelled. Incredibly, following his harrowing experience, Roland went on to have a prominent career as a NASA engineer, contributing significantly to the moon landing and patenting technology to protect space shuttle panels from extreme heat. However, despite his success, he remained haunted by the events of his childhood. Not so much the exorcisms themselves, but the fear that his true identity would be discovered. The majority of the priests never spoke about what occurred, apparently to protect his privacy. But one did keep a diary of the events, and Halloran, the priest who suffered the broken nose, revealed it, along with his own account, to author William Peter Blatty. Blatty transformed this real-life horror into a novel in 1971, which quickly became a bestseller and was adapted into a film. Roland's former companion later revealed that on Halloween, we always left the house because he figured someone would come to his residence and know where he lived and never let him at peace. He had a terrible life from worry, worry, worry. Fortunately, thanks to some creative license with the details in depicting Roland as a girl, the filmmakers preserved his identity until his passing in 2020. The Hills Have Eyes, 1977. It should come as no surprise that our final pick for the most terrifying Halloween movies based on a true story is another Wes Craven classic. This time, it's The Hills Have Eyes, a disturbing story of a stranded family becoming the target of a group of cannibal savages in the New Mexico desert. Horrifyingly, the true story behind it is just as, if not more, horrendous than Craven's chilling depiction. The real events took place in 16th century Scotland, where a young Sawney Bean lived in West Lothian. He came from a family of ditch diggers and hedge trimmers, and he spent his youth being trained in the trade. However, it all seemed a bit too much like hard work, so he ended up abandoning his family and running off with a local accused witch called Black Agnes Douglas. Together, they made their way to the Galloway coast, where they found a cave to make their home. To most people, it was inhospitable, as at every high tide, the first 200 meters of the mile-long cave system were submerged. But to them, it was the perfect hideout. The plan had been to earn a living through highway robbery, but Bean soon realized they'd be far more likely to evade capture if they killed their victims too. Then, as they had dead bodies to hand, they decided they might as well eat them, as it meant they wouldn't have to go to town for supplies. In this gruesome way, the couple managed to sustain not only themselves, but also their 14 children and 32 grandchildren, all born through incest and all sharing their parents' macabre taste for human flesh. Over the course of 25 years, the family killed, dried, pickled, and ate around 1,000 travelers and evaded all suspicion. Of course, locals noticed that people were going missing, but blame usually fell on the innkeeper of the last town they'd stayed. This led to the wrongful hanging of numerous innkeepers, all of whom maintained their innocence right up to the end. But despite wiping out the economy of the region, the executioners did nothing to slow the deaths. The turning point came when the Sawney Bean clan finally made a mistake. They attacked a couple traveling home from a fair, brutally murdering the woman in front of the man by slicing her throat and eagerly guzzling her blood. The man fought back with a sword and pistol and nearly met the same grim fate. However, just in time, another much larger group traveling from the same fair disturbed the fight, and the Sawney Beans were forced to retreat, leaving the woman's now mutilated body behind. With the evidence, the man traveled to Glasgow to report the attack. Desperate to finally put an end to the murders, the authorities summoned King James VI, who arrived 3 days later with 400 men. Armed with bloodhounds and the man who'd been attacked, they traveled to the coast and attempted to locate the clan. At first, they walked right past the cave entrance, just as countless others had done before them. But this time, the bloodhounds detected the stench of human flesh, went wild, and ran right into the cave. As many men as could fit followed them in through the twists and turns of the cave system until they came across what many described as the most revolting thing they'd ever seen. Limbs of men, women, and children were strung up against the walls like slaughtered cattle, and many more remains could be seen pickled and ready to eat. Alongside this were the piles of money and valuables they'd stolen from their victims. After a very quick resistance, all the members of the Sawney Bean family were arrested and escorted to Edinburgh. There, without trial, they were all executed, but not by gallows. Instead, the men had their genitals removed and thrown into the fire. Then their hands and feet were severed, and they were left to bleed to death. The women and children were forced to witness the gruesome spectacle before being burned at the stake like witches. The clan's brutal deaths were, according to Craven, no less horrendous than their own crimes, highlighting the thin veil of civilization and the fact that humans, no matter how civilized, still have the capacity for not only great good, but also great evil. And with that, we conclude our exploration of the chilling stories that inspired this season's most watched films. Did any of the tales surprise you? Will you find these movies more disturbing now that you know they're real-life inspirations? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so we can keep bringing you more videos like this.